I'm going to go into much more detail now in this lecture too, on the subject that the 1945 to 2019, but I'm going to move more quickly through some of the things. So we'll start just quickly with the 1950s and just remind that really anti-nuclear activism really arose mostly in the 1950s as more information began to come out about really how horrendous, more around the world, I should say, about how horrendous the actual humanitarian impacts of Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings were on the people. And then increasingly with the nuclear testing, and particularly 1954, we had the March 1954 Castle Bravo test that destroyed Bikini Atoll and actually rained radioactivity on quite a lot of populated islands, like Eniwetok and places like that in the Marshall Islands. And the children went out and played with it. They thought it was snow because they'd seen snow, on movies and in books, American. They didn't realize what this was. And then the women started giving birth to jelly baby, fetuses that could only live maybe an hour if they lived at all. And children started to fall sick. And, and 1954 also, there was one Japanese fishing ship called Lucky Dragon fishing boat there too. And this also, therefore, really precipitated the 1954 Japanese movement, as well as leading to things like the campaign for nuclear disarmament in 1958 in the UK, which developed this logo that is now universally thought of as the peace symbol, but actually was designed from the semaphore of nuclear, N for nuclear and D for disarmament, with the circle of the earth. This was how the design. But also in 1954, significant, when Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, made a proposal for a comprehensive test ban treaty, and really it was also a proposal for nuclear disarmament. And the UN Disarmament Commission did support this. So that was a critical year, 1954, and for me too, because I was born in 1954 on October the 3rd, as you know. But and then, so you got then this period from 54 to 63 in a lot of places in the world, a rise of civil society activism. But 1947, which was a little bit before that, actually scientists that left the Manhattan Project after Germany surrendered, when they realized that Germany did not have the nuclear bomb, because there were a number of scientists who only worked on the Manhattan Project because they thought it was necessary in case Germany, and they thought about it as deterrence, but they thought that Germany was developing a nuclear bomb, and that therefore America needed to. So I just wanted to start that background history, and then I talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the generations of children like me that did duck and cover. And this particular thing, I talked about that just as I was giving the basic introduction. So I'm now going to go into more detail, first about this. Also, I should have actually, I just quickly put some of my slides from the original slides from the lecture one into here, so they're a little bit out of order. I wanted just to bring you to another aspect of Einstein, because Einstein did send the letter, as I said, in the late 1930s, certainly in the 1940, I think it was, the letter that actually warned that America needed to develop nuclear weapons, perhaps, because of Germany. But in 1955, the eminent British philosopher, Lord Russell, and Albert Einstein, and it was the last thing really that Albert Einstein did before he died. He was living in Princeton at that time, and they wrote a letter that became the foundation of the organization Pugwash, which was of scientists for global security, really. And so I just wanted to bring that and then go back to just remind them that So I'm going to talk a little bit more detail about this partial test ban treaty and it leading to the NPT. And I'm going to talk in more detail about the NPT in this lecture and then go on to subsequent. So I was saying, certainly at lunch and maybe a bit earlier, we have to recognize that the NPT has been a very, very important international treaty, multilateral legal instrument from 1968 and still has a role to play. But it also was a treaty of the Cold War. That text came from a bilateral negotiation that left out everybody else until the US and the Soviet Union, till Moscow and Washington agreed a treaty text, and then they put it on the table and everybody basically had to agree. And all that the others were able to do was get a clear Article 6 on disarmament at that point. They couldn't get security assurances put in their promise of no use of nuclear weapons against NPT members who joined. They couldn't get any of that into that treaty. That was the treaty. It was a Cold War. And whether intentionally, but certainly through the next 3 or 4 decades, we began to see that this division, which was never in a treaty before, a division between those that had the nuclear weapons and those that did not, this non-proliferation. Normally treaties have the same obligations for everybody who signs up to them. But this was a new instrument, a non-proliferation instrument that defined 5 states that have nuclear weapons. They have an obligation to disarmament, as I said in Article 6. But this kind of thing had never been done before, and the political and international relations impact of that aspect of the NPT is still suffered, and I use that word, suffered, today. That it basically actually provided privilege that became status to nuclear weapon states. Nuclear weapon states was a definition in the treaty. It was not supposed to be about status. But that's what happened. And then the have-nots, and the have-nots were treated like second-class citizens. In fact, in a feminist analysis, I'm going to talk more about this in Lecture 5, but in a feminist analysis, frankly, the nuclear weapon states held for themselves the role of male leaders in the political firmament, and the non-nuclear states were treated as second-class citizens and as women, as people who could not be trusted to know what was best for their own security. So just keep that in mind as we go through some of these. So the partial test ban treaty, as I said, was very much, they'd been talking about it since 1954 as a comprehensive test ban treaty. But after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the UK, US, and USSR leaders got together and did tripartite negotiations. They actually still all wanted, or Eisenhower at least, and Khrushchev at that time, and Macmillan, who was the Prime Minister of the UK, they actually wanted a comprehensive test ban. They still did. But it became impossible for the US because the US scientists opposed, the US nuclear labs. Edward Teller, for example, a key scientist, he basically kept coming up with these technologically possible, feasible scenarios for cheating in deep underground salt caverns that the Soviet Union could cheat, and this could not necessarily be detected, and therefore an underground a ban on underground tests could not be verified. But they all agreed that they could mutually, through satellites and through their own national technical means, their own intelligence services, through the satellites and through seismic and through all of these other techniques, hydroacoustic, they could verify a ban on nuclear testing in outer space, underwater, and atmospheric. And in the end, that's what they agreed on. And in the preamble of the treaty, it called for comprehensive test ban treaty, but the treaty was a partial treaty, and the Americans still call it a limited nuclear treaty. They call it an LTBT, but most of us call it use the English, the French. It's obviously something different in different languages, but it's partial or limited, and it entered into force in 1963 on the 10th of October. But it actually took over 3 decades before we got the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And yet again, we saw that, civil society after the 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty, and even more after the 1968 Non-Proliferation Treaty, civil society, by that time there was the war in Vietnam. And a lot of civil society in the West, and particularly the US and UK and Europe, and I think also in Eastern movements, very much focused then on opposing, or at least, progressive civil society, focused very much on the Vietnam War. It became an anti-war movement, and then this became mobilized by the anti-war movement as a generic peace symbol and was everywhere. It was not only about nuclear, even though it's still the logo of Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, of which I'm a vice president, and of which Jeremy Corbyn, who's the leader of the opposition in the UK, was for many years with me as a vice chair and then a vice president. But still, it's the peace symbol now. But so you saw that shifting away from nuclear issues. So things like CND and the anti-nuclear movements, really, 60s and 70s, they did not have very much traction. And so the CTBT was also called for in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The discontinuance of all nuclear test explosions was called for in part of the preamble of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We got the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I will go into more detail in a moment. And then the 1970s, it was still the Cold War. It was the decade of détente, they called it. But what did we actually have that? We saw 2 more treaties that limited, we saw the treaties that limited nuclear weapon testing to 150 kilotons. There were 2 treaties because one limited for, in 1974, with regard to so-called nuclear testing for peaceful purposes. Remember, in those days, they still talked even about conducting nuclear explosions for peaceful purposes. And so that was limited, and so was the nuclear testing for weapons limited, and both were limited to 150 kilotons, and that was in the 70s. And that was also the decade when we got the Biological Weapons Treaty and so on. Now, the upsurge of civil society protests in the 1980s was not very much about nuclear testing at that point. It was about something called the Euro missiles. And again, I'm going to talk in much more detail about that later. And then we had this period in the 1990s of pre-negotiations, a lot of civil society activism and nuclear test moratoria that led then to the negotiations happening in 1994 to 96 in the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. Now, my book, which was published by the UN actually in 2009, but it was the book of the PhD that I ended up doing. I monitored in incredible detail, I lived in Geneva for the 3 years of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty negotiations, and that's really how I got involved with the NPT. So what we find after the PTBT is it did stop the huge US, Soviet, and British mushroom clouds. France and China carried on nuclear testing, atmospheric, until the 1970s, and then underground. But nuclear testing didn't stop. It went underground, out of sight, out of mind. But nuclear testing was still driving forward in a nuclear arms race. This is important to see. So proliferation was vertical. Then NPT really seriously slowed down and constrained horizontal proliferation but proliferation was vertical. So the nuclear armed states carried on proliferating, modernizing, we might call it now too. Different designs, certainly different warhead types for different delivery, carried on. Now, with the Partial Test Ban Treaty, in fact, China and France have still, to my knowledge, not ever signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty. They did in 1992 sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They didn't sign the Partial Test Ban Treaty because all of the provisions of the Partial Test Ban Treaty ended up being incorporated in the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty of 1996. And they participated in negotiations on that very, very considerably. And therefore, they preferred to join, or to sign at least, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So, but however, Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Islands particularly used the provisions and the common law aspect of the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which had entered into force from 1963 onwards, as legal mechanisms. They took particularly France to the International Court of Justice in 1973-74. And rather than, even though France had not signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty, France did not want to have that tested by the International Court of Justice, so France actually voluntarily gave up the atmospheric testing program in the Pacific completely, rather than go to court in 1974. France continued to conduct the underground nuclear testing in the Pacific until, as I spoke of before, 1995. China wasn't taken to court under the Partial Test Ban Treaty, but China watched what was happening, and very soon after France, China stopped doing atmospheric testing. But the arms racing of all of them continued. And here I just mentioned the 74 and 76 treaties that I talked about. Now I'm going to go into more detail on the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. It was negotiated, it was adopted in July of 1968. It entered into force March the 5th, 1970. So please, 5th of March, 1970. I think this was a typo, kind of late night thing. So this is the exact text of Article 1 and Article 2, just for so that you have it on your records. You can always Google the treaty. But the point about this is, these are the two key non-proliferation, where the nuclear weapon states promise that they won't transfer, they won't proliferate to other states. And any kind of nuclear weapons or explosive devices or control or anything like this, directly or indirectly. And Article 2 is then the reciprocal, that each non-nuclear weapon state party agrees not to receive any transfer whatsoever from anyone. And it was from any transferor whatsoever, so that would include any kind of black market or commercial, or, so it wasn't just saying they couldn't receive from another nuclear weapon state, it was that they couldn't receive, they wouldn't, if they joined this treaty, the NPT, they accepted an obligation not to receive anything that could lead to, either any weapons or nuclear explosive devices, etc. So that's that key aspect. Then, as I mentioned before, we had Article 3, which was the incentive clause. The Article 3, which was the safeguards clause, that each non-nuclear country joining the treaty was obliged to conclude a comprehensive safeguards agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency. And then nuclear weapon states, they were not obliged under Article 3 legally, but for political reasons, each of them did end up agreeing certain forms of safeguards that was called voluntary, but they couldn't be held to it legally. So then we get to Article 4, which is treated as a right, inalienable right of all the parties to develop research, production, and use of energy. And I've put that into red. But look at the words before it. It does not say Article 4 gives an inalienable right. It actually says there is already an inalienable right. It is a right under the UN Charter. It is a right in terms of economic freedom, development freedom, etc. It is an inalienable right. So what this actually says, that the treaty cannot be used to restrict that right to peaceful purposes, to the technologies for peaceful purposes, as long as the non-nuclear country is abiding by Articles 1, 2, and 3. That's what that actually says. It doesn't confer a right, it just says you can't take away that right as long as the non-nuclear country is adhering to and abiding by its legal obligations in Articles 2 and 3 in particular. And then the second part of that, Article 4, is about all the parties are supposed to facilitate and they have a right to nuclear exchange. And this is really the other half of what the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, does, is that's what they do, is they have two halves. They have the safeguards half, and then they have the technology sharing, technology assistance for peaceful purposes half. And there's a real contradiction, and it's an uneasy sharing of roles, and we can talk, perhaps it may come up more in questions, or these are the kind of issues that may come up in tomorrow. And then there is this incredibly, and then we have an Article 5. Now, Article 5 is still part of the treaty, but it was a conditional right both to conduct nuclear explosions, but more particularly because you can't conduct, a non-nuclear country cannot conduct nuclear explosions at all, because a device that can explode is actually a weapon device. It's a warhead, it's a bomb device. Therefore, they can't actually have those of their own if they're parties to the treaty as non-nuclear weapon states. So this was really that they were allowed, and I maybe should make that a bit clearer, to benefit from the fruits of another country that is allowed to do peaceful nuclear explosions, which was the decision that the 5 could still do. So the Article 5 had to do with benefits from nuclear explosions and the sharing of those benefits. And a decision was taken both in the UN Security Council and in the UN General Assembly, and then in 2000 in the NPT Review Conference, that Article 5 was recognized no longer to apply because it has been overtaken by the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, because the CTBT bans all nuclear explosions, whether, it doesn't make that distinction in terms of so-called peaceful. Now we get to Article 6. This is crucial for so many of the non-nuclear countries of the world, and crucial for the civil society of nuclear armed states in all kinds of ways. The nuclear armed states at that time, the US, UK, and Soviet Union at that time, when they did that negotiation, they didn't want to accept this, but they ended up realizing they had to promise. It was like this was the two sides of the coin. And this was together with this point that I made earlier this morning, that the treaty was only for 25 years, because it was conditional on there being nuclear disarmament. That was really, because if there wasn't going to be disarmament, then countries wanted the right to revisit their decision not to acquire nuclear weapons of their own. So they had to have this disarmament. And this Article 6 had 3 parts. One, and it was couched in language of negotiations, but didn't say they could be negotiations amongst each other, could be negotiations multilaterally with non-nuclear countries, some or all, but it's on effective measures to end the nuclear arms race. Then it adds on and to nuclear disarmament, and it doesn't specify, should this be incremental or should this be a nuclear disarmament treaty? And then the third part of that is and on a treaty on general and complete disarmament. So it's actually kind of connecting all of those things together. But it doesn't say anything about how that should be done. But note, it is an obligation on all of the parties of the treaty, not just the nuclear armed ones. It's a collective and individual. And then Article 7 is the nuclear weapon-free zones, the right of any group of states to establish nuclear weapon-free zones. And so the first actually predated the NPT, which is the Tlatelolco Treaty for the nuclear weapon-free zone treaty covering Latin America and the Caribbean. And next there was covering the Pacific, the South Pacific, the Treaty of Rarotonga, and then there was the Treaty of Pelindaba, covered the whole of Africa after the end of apartheid and after the after South Africa gave up its nuclear weapon states. So this covered the whole continent of Africa, the Pelindaba Treaty. Then there was also the Southeast Asian Treaty, which was basically the ASEAN non-nuclear countries. So it's called the Treaty of Bangkok. And then there was the Treaty of Central Asian Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone that could be negotiated only after the end of the Cold War with Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and so on, 5 of those. So, as I said this morning, there were 5 yearly nuclear 5 yearly review conferences, mostly held in Geneva, of the parties of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So it entered into force in 1970, there was one in 75, there was one in 1980, and I'm going to jump to 1985. But in both 75 and 80, basically the call for a nuclear test ban was probably the key issue. And we come to 1985, and by this time Greenpeace is a major civil society player in trying to get a nuclear weapon test ban. And it's sending the ship, the Rainbow Warrior, to Mororoa, which is the French nuclear test site. Now, even though France had stopped doing, by the way, I should say, before they even did this, and people forget this part of what Greenpeace was doing at that time, Greenpeace went to the Marshall Islands because the US, Washington, had begun to resettle people back into Rongelap and Eniwetok, some of these islands that had been contaminated in 1954 by the Bikini Atoll, and they'd been evacuated from there, and they lived in the most abject poverty without access to their own food sources and utterly dependent on the US. And we have to understand that history. And then they began to be resettled, which is what they wanted. And then they began to fall ill again, and their children fell ill. And they asked for help to be evacuated again, at least for the children and for women of childbearing age, the mothers and so on. So prior to these pictures, actually the Greenpeace had sent the Rainbow Warrior to help evacuate the Pacific Islanders who wanted to leave again because of the health and environmental and humanitarian impacts of the still existing radioactivity of those. And I'll talk more about those issues when I talk in lecture 5 about humanitarian impacts and so at this time of July 1985, we have the NPT Review Conference taking place, I think, in May of 85, and Greenpeace is making nuclear test bans, comprehensive test ban treaty, a major issue. And then Greenpeace is doing this direct action, and then their ship is bombed in Auckland Harbour. So this became a huge shock for Greenpeace, of course, and in time it was tracked back and to French Secret Service agents, and those Secret Service agents were in fact arrested by the New Zealand authorities because they were still in the country, and they were put on trial. I'm not going to go into detail about that. You can read about that in various places. So I'm going to jump now to 1990 and 92, because the 1990 Review Conference then had 2 major issues in it. One was the need to strengthen the safeguards regime, because it was seen to have happened that countries that had signed the NPT, like Iraq and other countries, had in fact developed very substantial nuclear programs. North Korea was another one, but there were several countries at that time. Thought, in fact, Brazil and Argentina at that time also they didn't join the NPT, so they didn't violate the NPT, but there was a lot of pressure on them to join the NPT from their neighbors in Latin America. Of course, at this time as well, for them, there were military juntas in charge of pretty much of both of those countries. So we have this political background. So the 1990 Review Conference was considered very important. And Greenpeace and others, however, made it about getting agreement from the US and the UK in particular, because Russia had already agreed to pursue a comprehensive test ban treaty. And in fact, by the time the NPT states were meeting in 1990, Russia had a moratorium on nuclear tests that was pushed by Gorbachev himself, but especially by the Kazakh people, who had insisted in 1989, had started a movement in 1989 to insist on closure of the Semipalatinsk test site. It was they called them their movement the Nevada Semipalatinsk movement. They made my first time to go to Kazakhstan was by that time I was employed by Greenpeace, and I was in fact their test ban coordinator internationally, was as a guest of this Nevada Semipalatinsk movement in 1989. So I was actually the person responsible in Greenpeace for the strategy to try to get the CTBT at the 1990 Review Conference. And we worked very closely with certain key states, but I would have to say particularly Mexico, a very important diplomat there, who was the ambassador of Mexico to the Conference on Disarmament. So, he died very recently. I'm sorry, I am now just blanking his name for 1 minute, but it'll come back to me. So we worked very closely with them, and in the end, the 1990 Review Conference could not adopt its review document on the issue of the US and the UK blocking a text that everybody else agreed to. Now remember, China and France were not members, were not parties of the NPT in 1990. So this sort of background, so we see that, and as I mentioned then, a legislative initiative through with Greenpeace working very closely with a number of US-based organizations and legislators got a moratorium on US. So the first moratorium was the Soviet moratorium. The second was the French moratorium. And the French issued their moratorium as soon as they'd finished their nuclear testing program that they undertook in 1995. They issued their moratorium before they did that. And they did this after some accidents. Sorry, I'm getting my timeline. They did in April 1992 was the French moratorium. And they held to it until 1995. But they hadn't expected to hold for it as long as that. And again, we can go into detail about that, but I just want to move. So here we have again that slide I showed you this morning of the Extension and Review Conference, because this then, so this then brings us, I just wanted to bring us up to 1992 so that we would understand how this leads to the CTBT. All these things were happening in parallel, so it's not possible for me with a slideshow to follow everything through directly in terms of dates. So it's easier to do it thematically. So I wanted to bring you into the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, to bring you up to 1990. But now I want to take you back to the 1980s, because so much changed then. And it was the fear of nuclear war and nuclear winter. It both provoked massive anti-nuclear protests in the 1980s, primarily initially in European countries and in the US and in Japan. And then it spread. But those were the first. And our Greenham Common Peace Camp, the Women's Peace Camp, became very much almost like a leadership initiative in that, as a grassroots initiative, and pursuing non-violent direct action and directly blockading the first US nuclear base where the US and NATO were going to put the first generation of the cruise missiles, the nuclear cruise missiles. There were three types. There were the cruise missiles, then there were Pershing, which were a ballistic missile. That was only going to be deployed in Germany on the west, and there were the SS-20s on the Soviet side. So those basically were the main intermediate range nuclear weapons, medium range. And the reason we didn't even use that term, like intermediate range, that was a technical term used by the arms controllers. But it was when they kept talking about being able to, for the US particularly, kept talking about fighting and winning a nuclear war in the European theatre. And they didn't mean Shakespeare. The European theatre was where they were going to fight their next war, their nuclear war. And there were a lot of short range. There were these new generation of medium range, and then, of course, the long-range strategic. But there was more and more of a view that a war would be started using these short-range and theatre nuclear weapons in Europe. And those of us that lived in Europe were saying, that's our home. What you're talking about is having a nuclear war that would utterly destroy Europe. And we think it would destroy the rest of the world. And that then, the World Health Organization, for example, was actually in 1983, World Health Assembly has a resolution that nuclear weapons constitute the greatest immediate threat to the health and welfare of mankind. Well, when you actually think that humankind faced still, all these other threats from all kinds of health threats emanating from diseases, pandemics, poverty, massive other kinds of wars, massive health threats and humanitarian threats. And then this is a quote from Mikhail Gorbachev. He made this quote, I think it was in 1992 or something. I have the direct reference. I don't know why I didn't put it here. I think it's probably in there. But anyway, this was kind of important. And I've obviously not finished that bit of red text there. But this is the direct quote from him that is put there, where he acknowledges there in the that in the 1950s, and we know also from Nancy Reagan's memoirs that the same thing happened to Reagan, that Reagan really was shocked when he heard about nuclear winter. That was the fundamental thing that changed his mind. So we go from these kinds of protests, and I am going to say just a little bit about Greenham Common here. So this one here was, we had this, if you look at this poster, it was December 12th and 13th. It was embrace the base on the Sunday and close the base on the Monday, which was, of course, a working day. We had 30 to 35,000 women who, and it was a freezing cold day with snow and sleet, who went to this place 60 miles west of London, but not that easy to get to, from all over. I was living there by this time, and I had just come out of prison. I had done my first period in prison from November 15th to 30th, or 28th, or something like that. And and 18 of us were sent to prison on November 14th and 15th. And suddenly the media was really interested, and when they put the microphones, they wanted to show us sort of with champagne, and we just said, no, we don't like, this isn't about champagne. This is, if we can spend 14 days in prison for what was called breaching the peace, which was occupying the main sentry box, the guard box of Greenham Common, if we can spend 14 days in prison under a 600-year-old law, a law called breach of the peace, that comes, the British imposed it on Hong Kong at that time, because it's from 1362 or something like that. This was the law that my first 2 prison sentences were under, this law, 600-year-old law, and we are trying to protect the world from nuclear weapons. So this is what they said, we were breaching the peace, and they wanted us to agree to be bound over to keep the peace, and we said that's exactly what we're doing. If you agree that what we're doing at Greenham Common is keeping the peace, we will sign. And of course they said, no, what you're doing at Greenham Common is breaching the peace. This is why we couldn't have that. But this was the day after. That is a US military bus trying to get through a sea of women, because 30 to 35,000 came on the Sunday and embraced the base in what was called, which was a very peaceful, it was very, very powerful. And we were hailed as concerned mothers, housewives and grandmothers. But 6,000 of those women, who many of whom also housewives and mothers and grandmothers, and many of whom were, students and all kinds, all walks of life, workers, teachers, took the day off work, 6,000, and put our bodies in front of the gates all the way around the 9-mile perimeter base. There were, we judged there were 7 gates. So we had people in front of all the gates that were possible to use for them, because we didn't want them even to open a very rare gate. So we were all in front of all 7 of those gates. And this is women singing, doing that. And I have some more photographs, but there's not time for very many of these. And then on New Year's Day of 1983, remember, NATO was going to start deploying the cruise missiles in 1983. 44 of us went in before dawn, before it got light, on New Year's Day, and we climbed over the fence and the barbed wire, we climbed through other fences, climbed up. They were building, they'd nearly completed, but not quite completed, this nuclear weapon bunker called a silo. So this became known as dancing on the silos. And there is some video footage, I sometimes use in talks that I do. We had some student filmmakers, one of whom went on to become the director of, if you've heard of Bridget Jones and those films, which I personally don't much like, but nevertheless, Biban, her first film was Us. Her student film was filming Us, Greenham Common. And she made a film, the two of them made a film called Carry Greenham Home. And I can make this available to you because they've given permission for the Global University. We can share this. But they actually filmed us doing this, and therefore the singing and, and all of that. And then, of course, we were arrested and held, and then... But the third one, that same... So in this middle one, you're seeing it filmed from outside the base, because everybody with cameras was outside the base. And then this view is exactly the same silo, but viewed from inside Greenham Common. And I took that photograph in, I don't know what year it was now, 2007 or something like that, where by now Greenham Common is no longer a military base at all. The US left in 1992 completely. And then we had a fight with the British government for it to be given back to the people, because it was common land. It was taken from common land to make an air base. So given back to the people. And we had a bit of a fight for that, but then it was restored to common land. And then people could take their dogs for a walk. These are actually dogs. I know one of them looks a bit like a rabbit, but he's actually a dog with pointy ears. People take their dogs, but they take their children for picnics now, Greenham Common. And this is Exmoor ponies, which are very rare indigenous British breed of small ponies. And they have put a herd of the Exmoor ponies because they're very good at cropping the grass, and they're very natural. So we're restoring it as common land. And this was our success, this INF Treaty. And for many, many years, till last year, I had those pictures showing that in 1987, Gorbachev and Reagan signed the INF Treaty, and it banned that whole class of not obsolete, state-of-the-art, modern theatre, medium-range nuclear weapons were banned. It was the first real prohibition treaty, but it was only regional. It was Europe, but it recognized Russia as a European state as well as an Asian state. I mean, so in fact, Russia signed it, agreeing not to deploy this class of weapons at all. This is part of some of the issues that come up. But anyway, and then this year, it was this year, wasn't it, when Trump's announced that because Trump was accusing Putin of violating the treaty, Putin was accusing the US of preparing to be able to violate the treaty in Poland with the missile defense deployments, not yet violating, but and again, we can go into more detail about the technologies of that when we look at those details. But this is the treaty. So we won back Greenham Common for the people, but nuclear weapons kept on being modernized, and that's the problem, and deployed. So when we think about paving the way for diplomacy, on nuclear issues, we think first and foremost of Geneva, the Palais des Nations, and the council chamber where the Conference on Disarmament meets. And so civil society played actually quite a crucial role on a number of issues. So I'm going to jump to this one next. So we got the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty in 1996. It was negotiated in the Conference on Disarmament, but it was not able to be adopted because India blocked. And India blocked on the issue of nuclear disarmament. We have to understand that linkage. They said that this treaty was only a non-proliferation treaty, and they wanted the treaty to contain an obligation to negotiate on nuclear disarmament. And there were some other issues around that. So the treaty text was taken to the UN General Assembly in September and debated by the General Assembly 9th and 10th of September, and then it was adopted by 153 states to 3 opposition, which was Libya, India, and Bhutan, which is a kind of satellite of India in many political terms, and then 5 states, abstained. So it was overwhelmingly adopted. So it was open for signature, 24th of September 1996, and I was one of the few people from the really civil society that was given a seat in the gallery, because the gallery was packed, actually, with diplomats and parliamentarians, and even the Secretary of Energy for the United States. She was in the gallery, sitting two rows behind me, watching, President Clinton, 1996. I think it was actually the foreign minister of Russia at that time, and the foreign minister of China, and the foreign minister. It was a mixture of presidents and foreign ministers, but it started with the 5, and all 5 of the nuclear weapon states on the 24th of September signed that treaty. And so did a lot more. I think by the end of that day, there were 70. And it kept amassing signatures. And I just looked last night at the CTBTO website, 184 signatures, massive. And then ratifications, 168, but the treaty has not entered into force. And this is because of nuclear armed states' rivalry. Not just the 5, but ways in which they all wanted to be sure that another state, so they wanted to make sure that India and Pakistan and Israel, from different angles, and Pakistan also wanted to make sure, all of these states, and India wanted to make sure that China, and you've got all of this, and they all put that into the entry into force provision and required that it could not enter into force unless there was signature and ratification by 44 states on an IAEA list of states with nuclear programs. So that also included North Korea, South Korea, it included. So we still lack 8 states. But the verification regime is very, very solid indeed. So I'm going to leave us there and go back to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, because we now got the CTBT. Even if it hasn't entered into force, it is legally binding on a lot of states. It also is almost part of international law through common law. It plays an incredibly important role, and it has a very powerful verification regime. So in 2000, we had the most successful, remember 5 years after we had that package of indefinite extension plus the principles and objectives, we got 7 countries called themselves the New Agenda States, and they went to the NPT in 2000 with a plan of action. And they ended up getting negotiations directly between them and the 5 nuclear armed states. By this time, it was all 5, because China and France, as I said, joined the NPT, as did Brazil and South Africa in that period, 1991 to 1992. And interestingly then, so China and France were now there as part of the little club of the haves, and Brazil and South Africa were very leading, together with Mexico, New Zealand, Egypt, Ireland, Sweden, leadership of this new a new agenda coalition on behalf of the non-nuclear countries. And you see there, this new agenda coalition had some non-aligned countries, some global south countries, and some European countries, and it was quite important. And what they got was this plan of action. And this plan of action had early entry into force of the CTBT, continuing the testing moratorium on all states until the CTBT entered into force, and this even was able to be used to persuade India and Pakistan to at least have a bilateral moratorium of India and Pakistan not to do nuclear testing. Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty. Do we have this treaty? Anybody know? Do we have a treaty that ends the production of highly enriched uranium and plutonium for nuclear weapons? Do we have this treaty? Anybody able to answer me? Do we have a treaty, a fissile material cutoff treaty? No. Yet they agreed to it in 1995, and then they agreed to it again in 2000, and the Conference on Disarmament has ever since 1990, well, really since it concluded the CTBT, to be truthful, it has not succeeded in having negotiations for more than a few weeks in 1998. It is a very expensive exercise in how not to do nuclear diplomacy. And that, so we don't have that treaty even. And then they wanted, in 2000, they wanted the CD to revitalize work on nuclear disarmament. And many states tried, but they haven't succeeded. Remember, the CD is only 66, it's only 1/3 of the world's nations. So it actually has some problems there, because what about the other 2/3? They do not have a vote. They have a voice only as observers. And this can include some really quite significant states. So there are problems. This is still a Cold War thing. Then wanting irreversibility. So every time there is a nuclear treaty, it has to be irreversible. This becomes a principle. Unequivocal undertaking by the nuclear weapon states to accomplish the total elimination of their arsenals. All 5 of the nuclear weapon states within the NPT all agreed to this in 2000, all 5 of them. All 5 of them agreed to this, and by 2001, they were rapidly trying to renege. The START reductions and ABM treaty were included in these 2000, that there needed to be more reductions and preservation of the ABM treaty. Can anyone remember? So again, US, Russia, who are the 2 key signatures of the ABM treaty, they both agreed in 2000 to continue with the ABM treaty and to continue with START reductions. Did they continue with the ABM treaty? Do we know? Do we have an ABM treaty in force now? No. We did have one from the 1970s. What happened to it? What happened to it? Louder, please. Ah, we do. The US government of George W. Bush Jr. in 2002 withdrew the US from the ABM treaty against all the opposition of the Democrats, all the opposition of Russia and China, UK, all of these, they withdrew. And that then opened the door to missile defense, to Reagan's dream of Star Wars, which he couldn't actually pursue because the ABM treaty was still in force in the 80s. And The Trilateral Initiative was a fissile material initiative. And then there were these further, again, commitments undertaken by all of the nuclear armed states in the NPT, that they would reduce their arsenals unilaterally as well as bilaterally, plurilaterally, so it opened the door to 5-power negotiations, and multilaterally for the 5 to negotiate with other nuclear armed states and with non-nuclear armed states, all of this, and to do this with a degree of transparency, both about their negotiations and about their actually weapons holdings and all of that. Then this whole issue to include, as well as strategic nuclear weapons like START, the non-strategic or the so-called tactical. They promised to reduce the operational status of their nuclear weapons, which particularly was something that applied to the US and the UK, Russia, and France, which all actually deployed nuclear weapons on high alert status. So de-alerting, which was really pushed by a lot of NGOs also in the US and a number. It didn't really apply to China because China has never deployed its nuclear weapons on a high alert status, although this looks as like a direction that China is moving in now, potentially. So this is and then also there was a lot of pressure for some kind of commitments on the use of nuclear weapons. China, of course, has a no first use policy and a commitment not to use nuclear weapons at all against non-nuclear weapon states. But at this time in 2000, the US, NATO didn't and doesn't. At this time in 2000, Russia did have some form of no first use and some form of no use commitments, but Putin has now moved away from that. And so this call for the engagement of all 5, and then there were these other issues about regular reporting and verification research and such, which is very useful. And, you know, and I've written a lot on this, and the IPFM, the International Panel on Fissile Materials, has worked on then some of the verification issues. So then we jump. So 2000, we had then 2001, we had 9/11 under a Republican administration led by George Bush Jr. And then in that decade, the next review conference, 2005, John Bolton, who has come up again in our news because Trump took him on as special advisor. George W. imposed him. He couldn't even get a vote through Congress for John Bolton to be the UN ambassador, but he wanted him to be the UN ambassador for the US. And so he imposed it under a short-term executive decision. And John Bolton did the utmost he could to wreck multilateralism and through the UN. And the result was that the 2005 NPT review conference was the worst I have ever attended. Real political conflicts on all fronts. So here we're now seeing some real problems with the NPT really coming much to the fore. That the NPT had become an instrument for controlling the non-nuclear weapon states that was inadequate to do any real control and pressure on the nuclear weapon states. And that was never its intention in '68, but it was written into the treaty in certain structural ways, and it maybe was the intention of the US and Soviet Union at that time. The NPT never ever addressed use and deployment or production, for that matter, of nuclear weapons. And so these were issues that really need to be addressed. It connected also non-proliferation to the technologies for civilian nuclear energy. So it was trying to say it was against proliferation, but it was pushing the technologies on a lot of developing states, because by this time, in this period 2000, 2010, the nuclear industries of France and UK's had practically collapsed, of France and China needed new markets for their nuclear, civil nuclear energy, and were increasingly arguing this. And we had countries, obviously, Iran we know about, but Saudi Arabia. We had countries, a lot of countries from the NAM also wanted to kind of keep some options open. So you had this weird thing. And then Article 6 had no timelines, no mechanisms, no oversight. And actually we heard some nuclear governments, including the UK Prime Minister Tony Blair, got into an argument with Mohammed el-Baradei because Tony Blair asserted in 2006, at the time of the decisions to renew Trident in the UK, Tony Blair asserted that the NPT gave the UK the right to keep and modernize nuclear weapons as long as we wanted to. And Mohammed el-Baradei, who was the Secretary General of IAEA, said, no, it doesn't. It doesn't give you that right. So in this period, we got different kinds of ways of change that were looking at things. We began to get the statements on deterrence from, as I mentioned this morning, and we started to get, by the 2010 NPT Review Conference, a combination of civil society. I was particularly working behind the scenes with certain countries like Norway, Brazil, again, Norway, Brazil, Mexico, pretty much the New Agenda Coalition behind the scenes. We were working, but Austria came in at that point into this. We're not part of the New Agenda Coalition, but Austria was really very instrumental for us, and Ireland, of course, in 2010. And we got this as part. Now, it was only an expression of concern, but it mentions catastrophic humanitarian consequences. It mentions the use of nuclear weapons for the first significant time in NPT. And it reaffirms the need for all states at all times to comply with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. And by that time, we had the 1996 International Court of Justice opinion that basically it could not completely rule out any possible use. It was a divided opinion, but it did essentially rule out almost all the militarily significant uses of nuclear weapons would be contrary to international humanitarian law. You couldn't use it against cities or towns. And the other thing that was in the Disarmament Action Plan, but not as an action point, but as an action, a framing, almost like a preamble, but a framing for all of the action points, was this paragraph, which specifically uses the language calling for establishment of the necessary framework to achieve and maintain a world without nuclear weapons. Obama's phrase put into the NPT, and also a phrase that was undertaken by Ban Ki-moon as Secretary General of the United Nations in a speech he made in 2008, where he came up with a 5-point action plan, and he specifically referred to negotiations on a nuclear weapons convention. In this English usage, convention also means treaty. They're interchangeable in this. Convention can mean a meeting, but in this context, he meant a treaty. A nuclear weapons convention or agreement on a framework of separate, mutually reinforcing instruments backed by a strong system of verification. Now, these two clauses, most of all, led us, we already ICAN had already been founded in 2007, but came to 2010 very much with the strategy that I'd been developing then with the two Australian leaders of ICAN, that we connected this up. So we got this language. I played the key role in that. And the minute that the 2010 review conference was over and they had successfully adopted not the entire document, but by consensus, the document that had 64 action points and these particular paragraphs, these were part of the consensus part, we moved quickly to get some funding to establish ICAN in Geneva. And by the end of 2010, I had established an ICAN identity under Swiss law that brought it into something that could be much more international, but using the name and the logo and directly connecting with the ICAN that had been founded in Australia. So this was part of it. And so this is the context for applying humanitarian disarmament approaches to nuclear weapons. So it's the 21st century is really, security is collective. It's way beyond the military interests of nuclear-armed states, whether P5, who still are permanent on the Security Council, or any country with nuclear weapons. And then the international humanitarian law had become increasingly important. It had banned landmines, banned cluster munitions. It was increasingly playing a role. And remember, international humanitarian law governs what governments, what states can do in war. It governs the military, the war activities. Therefore, it governs decisions made about weapons, critically in this. Whereas, again, the NPT form of international law was seen as governing more what states do. Arms control was seen very much as a foreign policy. And non-proliferation, it was seen, as a foreign policy issue. And in fact, there was an agreement that was put on the record by NATO states that actually exempted the NATO nuclear sharing from Articles 1 and 2 obligations because it predated, and because they said that the NPT would cease to apply in time of war. Well, that's the time you need the treaties to apply. So they actually said that they did not, they had this nuclear sharing arrangement through NATO with these countries that hosted nuclear weapons, that even, did fly, the flying of planes on nuclear exercises and had nuclear doctrines in common. But it didn't violate the NPT because those countries which had German pilots or British pilots or Italian or Dutch pilots or Turkish pilots, that they wouldn't receive control of the weapons except in time of war. And that argument was made. But international humanitarian applies to time of war. And then, of course, the key point was we decided to argue about this by targeting our arguments towards civil society in all nuclear-armed countries, and also, but particularly to the civil society and the governments of the global south, of the nuclear weapon-free zone countries, the nuclear-free countries, we came to call them. And I put this cartoon here because it just reminds us of the India-Pakistan standoff after 1998. And, that what it says, if you can't read it, is the government can't afford to give you an education, so the leaders of both these countries are telling to their civil, the children, we can't afford to give you an education because we've got to teach our enemies a lesson. And who were their enemies? For India, it was Pakistan. For Pakistan, it was India. For India, it was China. Please. And of course, the UK was doing their own modernization. All the nuclear armed states were modernizing. So we had a humanitarian process, and it had meetings held in first Oslo, then in Nayarit in Mexico, and then Vienna. And these were to build understanding. And I'm going to talk much more about that particular aspect of it, of the development of the humanitarian narrative and arguments. But here I just want to look at the treaties. So I'm going to jump from December 2014, the Vienna meeting. And remember, Vienna is also the seat of the CTBTO and the IAEA. And 2015 is when there is a key non-proliferation treaty meeting, the next review conference after after 2010 is 2015. So there are 5 years of the humanitarian initiative developing out of the conference, the NPT conference in 2010. We're now coming towards 2015. And during that time, the core group, which was sort of the New Agenda States Plus, so it included Nigeria and as well as South Africa, it included Kenya, included Philippines and Thailand, and so on. They were meeting, and of course ICANN was going from strength to strength until we had over 500 NGO partners in over 100 countries. So this was the time here. So this was particularly a pledge calling on all NPT states to identify and pursue effective measures to fill the legal gap for the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons. This was such an important pledge and got massive sign-on from NPT states in 2015. But the 2015 conference, not on this issue at all, but it also failed to adopt any kind of consensus document. But at that time, it was a Middle East issue. This had been the key take-home from the 2010 conference for the states. We had our take-home, which was below radar, which is to get that humanitarian and reference to the Nuclear Weapon Treaty, the Nuclear Weapon Convention, but that was it went below the radar. But the public thing was the Middle East, and it was a conference on Middle East, WMD free zone. So then there were, under the UN General Assembly, there were these 2016 a thing called Open-Ended Working Group, which is open to all of the General Assembly states, and it was chaired by Thailand. And Thailand then, they adopt by big majority, but not by consensus. The Open-Ended Working Group doesn't have to work by consensus because it's a body from the UN First Committee. And so then Thailand essentially led taking a resolution calling for actual negotiations in 2017 to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons leading to their total elimination. That was adopted overwhelmingly, but overwhelmingly by the global South countries, the non-nuclear countries, by the First Committee, and they further got through adoption to allow for them to have 4 weeks of negotiations using UN facilities in 2017, which isn't very long for a treaty. And it had to be done in that time because, of course, at the end of 2016, we know that Trump had been elected. But he just didn't have a team in place, and the Obama administration decided to allow to agree and not to block the decision on financing the 2017 negotiations, although they didn't like it. And I just love this picture before, because this is a group of Korean, Japanese, and then some of us international, I mean, even in there, who were at the peace boat, the peace boat that from Japan came to New York while the first committee was taking place. And we did this demonstration against the backdrop of the UN. But I liked it that it had hibakusha from Hiroshima and Nagasaki together with Korean hibakusha, together with young people and, some of us who were really playing that key role. So now, as we know, there were months of negotiations, because although we only had the funding for 4 weeks of negotiations in the UN, and the chair of the negotiations was Ambassador Elaine White Gomez of Costa Rica. So she was from a very significant anti-nuclear and, to be honest, anti-militarist player from South Latin America, and a woman. Now, we didn't say that had to be the case. The governments chose who they wanted to be their president, but this is who it was. And the negotiations actually took place over the whole year. They actually started in January, with her doing a lot of preparatory work, and we worked behind the scenes with that as civil society. But there were only 4 actual weeks in the UN negotiating chamber under UN General Assembly auspices of the negotiations. And these negotiations were boycotted by, guess who? Sadly, all of the nuclear-armed states boycotted, whether they publicly said they were boycotting or they just didn't turn up. The US, UK, and France publicly said they were boycotting. And they held a press conference outside the entrance, within the UN. They called it a stakeout. Trump's, Nikki Haley, Trump's UN ambassador at that time. But they didn't stop it. They couldn't block it. So they were just absent. But in fact, there was at least one NATO member inside the negotiations for the whole time, negotiating. Why? Although NATO had, the US, UK, and France really imposed a heavy pressure on all NATO countries to boycott, and nearly all of them did, and all the nuclear allies to boycott. The Dutch Parliament, which civil society had engaged with in all this time, the Dutch Parliament instructed the Dutch government that it must not boycott these multilateral UN treaty negotiations. And that's very, very important. Again, we're seeing how this works. So these were the initiatives leading to it. I've talked about it, so I'll leave that slide there. Why we have to have a humanitarian approach, and I think the pictures, I just wanted the pictures to speak for themselves. You see, this is because I then started, there's the duplications there, which I'll take out again. Some of those I had just suggested in my initial intentional PowerPoint. Now we're going to talk, and this is where I'm going to end this part of the session, is actually bringing us up to date on what this UN treaty that was adopted on the 7th of July by 122 NPT member states, also UN General Assembly member states. So they were both members of the UN General Assembly and members of the NPT. 122 of those states adopted this treaty on July 7th with 1 vote against, and that was the government of the Netherlands. Parliament had only instructed them to participate in negotiations. It had not instructed them to vote for it. And the other one was Singapore. Kind of strange, but we know that the nuclear-armed states put enormous pressure on all of their, you know, the Francophone, or the, you know, the African Francophone countries, the Pacific Africa, they came under incredible threats and pressure to be absent from the room by France. The British did the same for their group. Although, you know, for various reasons, the British were very confused because we were already suffering all the effects of the Brexit disaster. So, but the US used checkbook diplomacy, tried to bribe countries, tried to threaten them that they would not receive aid if they voted in favor. So actually, it is extraordinary in those conditions that 2/3 of the UN General Assembly, who are also 2/3 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, voted to adopt this treaty, and this included countries like Iran, voted to adopt this treaty. So the treaty, the preamble, you can download this treaty from the UN website or from the ICANN website, you know, in its text on the UN website in 5 languages. So it's in Chinese on the UN website. It's in French, Chinese, Arabic, Spanish, and English, all the UN, because it's a UN treaty. It is a UN treaty. No matter that it was boycotted by the Security Council permanent members, they didn't have a say in it. They boycotted the negotiations, but they cannot stop it being a UN treaty. So the UN now promotes this treaty. It was opened for signature in September of 2017 at the UN General Assembly by the Secretary General. It's a UN treaty. And it now has 70 signatories, and I think the latest count was 23 ratifications. So it is nearly halfway to entry into force. Entry into force, you know, has to be done by governments and parliaments. And every government has its, or every nation has its own treaty ratification processes, and they are all different. So the executive, the president, the government, the foreign ministers, the executive branch can sign treaties, but the legislative branch normally has to ratify. And so far 20, and it's normally quite a lengthy process. And what the requirement is 50 states have to have signed and ratified, and then the treaty has entered into force. But it has this strong humanitarian preamble, and I will talk about this more in 4 and 5. And then these prohibitions. Now, what I want to say about these prohibitions are that they deal with all of the operative, physical, scientific, and operational activities that would enable any country to use nuclear weapons. And they apply to all. They apply to nations, but nations have to apply them to their people. So they actually apply through that mechanism to non-state actors as well. They pick up the NPT thing about transfer, but they do not have the possibility of the caveat that NATO states have put in about the transfer articles from the NPT. So they go beyond the NPT in those. D is crucial. They actually prohibit using and threatening to use nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. And they prohibit assisting or encouraging or inducing anyone else to engage in this activity. And this is not just inducing among states, it's anyone. So this again refers to, individual people, companies, all of these. You can't seek or receive assistance, and they do not allow any stationing, installation, or deployment of any nuclear weapons. So this is crucial for countries like Norway that very much supported, under their previous government, supported this treaty, started it off actually in many ways with the Oslo Conference, because they're members of NATO and they participate in nuclear doctrines, but they don't actually station weapons. So these are key issues. Then they also set out the objectives and basic means by which nuclear-armed states and also nuclear-dependent allies, or what we are now increasingly calling nuclear-endorsing states, NATO, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, basically, how they join the treaty. And they can either sign first and then negotiate a timetable to eliminate, or they eliminate first and then they join the treaty, which is what South Africa did when it joined the NPT. And then there's other provisions. So I'm actually going to leave this lecture here and pick up in lecture number 4 with this slide, which is looking at 2019 and some of these familiar challenges that we have. So I'll just leave this. I think, yes, that's my last of the. So I'm just going to leave this, and this then segues into the issues on nuclear deterrence, nuclear force projection, the very much establishment kind of view, and segues into looking from those kinds of things into what this international humanitarian law treaty that is about disarmament, but picks up where arms control and non-proliferation have a legal gap. That's going to be the major issue that I focus on in lecture 4. And then I pick up the civil society parts of that much more, and the thinking behind it in 5. So let's leave it there. And again, I think it worked quite well for you to have time to think about questions and then come back with them, because I know today time was a bit limited because of these other issues. But so I'm going to suggest that you come back with your questions, and we'll start after tomorrow morning. We have the Fukushima colleagues coming tomorrow morning. So we'll start tomorrow afternoon with some of your questions around what you've heard here. And this is when also I can pick up the questions that were given to me that I have not yet answered here, particularly about some of these dilemmas. So I'm sorry that this was a heavy one, these 2 lectures, and there wasn't time for questions at this point, but it seemed like it was sort of necessary to get through quite a lot of information before we could really start to discuss the politics. And I hope I've done that now.
Thank you.